Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And this is going to be the first of hopefully a series of videos on different approaches to narrative, different techniques that you can use to analyze narrative, to understand narrative, and that may give you different insights, different tools to use when you're reading, when you're watching TV, when you're watching a film, when you're listening to a radio play. Different ways of thinking about the stories, the narratives, the texts that we enjoy and we consume and that are part of our lives, that are part of these things that go into our brains and help us either entertain us or think about new things. And the first one that I want to talk about is, in a roundabout way, it's going to address what we think narrative should do. And I admit, it's going to seem about a bit of a roundabout way to do this, but I promise it should make sense if I do my job right. So what I want to talk about are narrative kernels and narrative satellites. And this is because we're going to start with what is a narrative, what is the difference between plot and story, and how that relates to narrative. And then I want to talk about narrative kernels and narrative satellites, what that tells us about narrative, and sort of try to bring everything together here at the end. Will it work out? No idea. Trying to record this. So I'm sure you have heard the writing advice that you should get rid of everything that does not serve the narrative. And as a piece of writing advice, that seems absolutely essential. You know, like pare everything away so you're just serving the narrative. Absolutely brilliant advice. It's contingent on one thing, though. What is a narrative? And this, I think, is where sometimes when you have people who are experts at creative writing, experts in the field of analysis, experts in literary analysis, experts in narrative analysis, and us, the common reader, the normal person who's sitting reading, when we hear different people use the term narrative, we have our idea that maybe narrative is just synonymous with story, or narrative is just synonymous with the thing that we're watching, that narrative is just another word for it. But different groups, different specialisms, have different ways of defining narrative. So when someone says, as creative writing advice, you should only write just the things that serve the narrative, it makes perfect sense to us. Don't include extraneous material. That's going to detract from your story. It's going to slow down your plot. And we think narrative, plot, story, all these words all just mean basically the same thing. And that's how we use them in everyday language, in everyday discourse. And even I, in doing videos like this, I will switch between them because this is generally me chatting and it's not me giving a formal lecture on the subject. But narrative, plot, and story are not the same. And if they were all the same, like, why have all of these different words? We have different words because they have slightly different meanings and we use them in different ways. And one of the ways, and it was the way that I was taught, is narrative is a sequence of events. That's what a narrative is. I get up in the morning, I have a shower, I put on my clothes, I go to the shops, I buy something, I come home, I go back to bed. That is a narrative. It is a sequence of different events. Is it an exciting narrative? No, it's an incredibly boring narrative, but it's a sequence of events. And it was told chronologically. You can see it went through starting in the morning and time flowed normally. It was a progression of these events as they would have occurred temporally, chronologically in that sequence. And therefore, that's what story is. Story is a narrative that is being told or explained or experienced in chronological sequence. And you go, well, why have the two different words then? They are just synonymous. And you go, well, what if we take exactly the same example? I get up in the morning, I have a shower, I get dressed, and then I remember what happened the night before. I had gone to the bar and I had met some friends. Now we're getting into what you would call a flashback sequence, what in a lot of narrative theory and things like that, we call an analeptic sequence, analepsis, going back in time. And so if I was to reorganize that into chronological sequence, I went to the bar. I met my friends. I had a drink. We chatted. I came home. I went to bed. I got up in the morning. I had a shower. I've just changed the sequence of events and reordered them chronologically. So that's what story is. Story is the reorganization of the narrative events into a chronological sequence. So a narrative are the narrative events. So what then is plot? Plot is when we get a text, when we get a narrative, plot is the sequence in which those narrative events are narrated to us or we experience. So in the first example, plot and story would have been exactly the same because it was in a chronological sequence, so it's a story, but that's also the plot. The plot of the second version would be I got up in the morning, I had a shower, I got dressed, I went to the shops, and then I remembered that the previous night I'd gone to the bar and I'd had a few drinks with friends and I was sitting chatting with my friends and I said, tomorrow I have to go. That is plot because it's not in a chronological sequence. It's the sequence of narrative events as narrated to the narratee, the reader, the viewer, the person experiencing it. That sequence of events is not in a chronological order, and the narrative is being experienced in a non-chronological way because there are reasons for it that have to do with what effect the writer wants to have on the reader. So why do we have these different distinctions? And it's so when we have narratives that don't follow a strict, all of these events happen in this order, because lots of narratives have flashback sequence. Lots of narratives show events out of sequence. And so it gives us a different way of describing it. The narrative is the thing. Plot is the order in which we encounter the thing. Story is reorganizing everything in the thing into a chronological sequence. Is it necessary when you're reading a book to have all of these things in your head? Probably not. But when we come to describe it, when we come to think about it, when we come to discuss it, having these different words is actually very, very useful because it is shorthand then for discussing it, and we all know what we're talking about. And when authors play around with chronological sequencing, it's nice to be able to accurately depict that instead of constantly having to describe. You can just use the word plot. Plot means the order you encountered it in the book. Story is when you've reordered it chronologically. And you don't need to say, right, so when we're talking about this thing, I am going to reorder it chronologically. So we're encountering the narrative chronologically. It saves words. And it's just a term and a concept. But the big element that this emphasizes is that narrative is not fixed. Narrative is flexible. Narrative is something that means different things to different people. So when you get writing advice, it has to serve the narrative. That might be great advice, but then you're making a judgment about what the narrative is, what the narrative should be doing, which takes us on to kernels and satellites. So if a narrative is a sequence of events, there are going to be some events that are absolutely crucial to a narrative, that the narrative cannot function without. So in the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, if Frodo is not given the ring at the start, you cannot have the narrative. If Frodo went from the Shire directly to Rivendell, yeah, you can have the narrative. All of those events that I just cut out, Tom Bombadil, Old Man Willow, meeting Aragorn, none of those things have to occur for the narrative to happen. Frodo just has to get to the Council of Elrond. So all of those events, we could, from one perspective, call narrative satellites, because narrative kernels are the events that are absolutely necessary for the narrative to occur. Narrative satellites, no matter how good, how important, how wonderful, whether they are brilliant character moments, whether they develop depth of character, whether they explore the world building that are create enormous flavor or texture or beauty in the world, that are wonderful little self-contained vignettes. No matter what they are not absolutely essential to the narrative. They are digressions. They are extraneous. They are not actively and solely serving the narrative. They are serving an additional purpose, which is to make the narrative more engaging, or to develop the narrative world, to develop characters, to develop character relationships, to affect pacing. That it's not just a headlong rush through one narrative event after another, that we have moments of pause where we have digressions, where we can slow down, where we can recover from the hectic pace of something before. That's what narrative satellites are. Now, in that example I gave, someone might say, oh, but you removed the scene where he met Aragorn. And you go, yeah, but Aragorn's at the Council of Elrond. That's where he met Aragorn there. What's the big deal? You don't need the scene where he meets Aragorn and Bree. That's not a crucial scene for the entire narrative of the Lord of the Rings. It is a brilliant scene. It's an interesting scene. It adds a whole load of depth to the Hobbit's characters, to Aragorn, and it gives him a sense of mystery. And it's about the initial sense of distrust and how that trust is built over time. It adds to the narrative. But if we took a strictly narrative view, those scenes are not strictly necessary for the narrative to function, even though it's a great scene, even though it's an interesting scene, even though it's a good scene. The whole episode with Tom Bombadil is a perfect example of this, because obviously in the Fellowship of the Ring, the book, we meet the hobbits get trapped by Old Man Willow. Tom Bombadil comes along, rescues them. We have this whole thing where he tries on the ring and it doesn't have any power on him. He entertains the hobbits. They meet Goldberry. There's lots of singing. Then the hobbits go off and they end up on the Barrow Downs and they get trapped by the Barrow-wights. And then Tom Bombadil comes along and saves them. And this is where the hobbits get their swords, which is, you go, this is really important. And then from there, they go to Bree and they meet Aragorn and blah, 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 blah. So, well, that's where the hobbits get their swords. It's really important to the narrative. Peter Jackson doesn't have that in his adaptation. He doesn't have the Old Man Willow scene. He doesn't have the Tom Bombadil scenes. He doesn't have the Barrow Down scenes. None of those things are in the film. Therefore, when we look at the Fellowship of the Ring, the film created by Peter Jackson, is it a complete narrative? Yes, it works as a solid narrative, even with those scenes removed. Those scenes get taken out. Does the narrative fall apart because those scenes aren't there? No, it doesn't fall apart. Do those scenes add something to Tolkien's work? Of course they do. But from a solely narrative perspective, those are narrative satellites. You can dispense with them, and all you're left with are the scenes that are absolutely necessary for the service to the narrative. And this is where we get into when we are evaluating texts, when we are experiencing it, when we're going through it for the first time, when we are reading through, we will not know what is a satellite and what is a kernel, because we're experiencing the plot. It is not clear to us. You can only, or generally, you can only, okay, let's rephrase. Generally, it is easier to identify narrative satellites once you have experienced the narrative and then think about it. Go back in time, go back over it. So you read through the first time, that's you experiencing plot. And a plot of a book may not work for you because that's all to do with how you've experienced the narrative events. But when you finish it and you think back, you go, hang on. And let's say you reread. And now, because you're not focused on plot, you're not focused on the sequence of events, you already know what occurs in the narrative. You're now experiencing it in a different way because you're not trying to find out what happens next. You're not trying to work out what is going to be important and what isn't going to be important. As you go through, you actually have that awareness. And when you get to those areas where you go, this wasn't important for the end. However, what is happening here is I'm getting character development. I'm getting world building. I'm getting character interaction. This is tying up, or this is foreshadowing something that happens later on. And it's what gave that thing later on added resonance. So that's why satellites and kernels are an interesting way to look at narrative, and understanding that narrative is formed in different ways. It can be a story, it can be a plot, but narrative is just the sequence of events. So tying this kind of together, when we read a novel and we get to a section in which we go, oh, the pacing, it's slowed down, nothing is happening. It's very often that that section is a narrative satellite rather than a narrative kernel, because narrative kernels deal with particularly specific events that are intrinsic and integral to the narrative. A narrative satellite is something that is doing something else. So when you get to a section in a novel where things slow down, where it just seems to be these characters talking, it's not that nothing is happening. It's that no major narrative events are happening. But what we have in that section is character development. We have dialogue. We have world building. We have the fleshing out of the narrative. Because a narrative that is composed solely of narrative events is quite often the skeleton of a narrative. And in order to create an enjoyable experience for readers, authors build on that. They add in these narrative satellites, which can be incredibly important. It's not to say that satellites are unimportant. They serve a different function. They build on the skeleton of the narrative events to flesh it out, to create a more complete experience. And because of that, because of how we value, whether we value narrative events highly or we value character development highly, this is always a balancing act between the things that interest us. But being able to isolate them, being able to think about them in those terms, gives us an additional way of focusing on what the narrative is actually doing and not what our expectations are about what the narrative should be doing. Because if we take our expectations of what a fantasy novel should do, and we read, say, Jane Eyre or Pride and Prejudice or something by James Joyce, could we read those books in the same way that we read fantasy? Our expectations for those novels would be entirely different, because you don't read a James Joyce novel and go, oh, well, nothing happened. You go, things do happen, but you don't have epic battles. You don't have action sequences. You don't have that sort of thing. You have something different happening, which is you have narrative events, you have character dialogue, but it's operating in a different way. When we look at Sense and Sensibility or Pride and Prejudice, again, we don't have battles, we don't have fights, we don't have all of these sorts of things, but we have character dialogue. That's a narrative event because it's going to affect the character lives, and that's what the narrative is focused on. So what is in service to the narrative is going to depend on the type of narrative and the reader expectation for that type. And that's not even getting into postmodern approaches to what narrative does or post-structural approaches to what narrative does. There are all of these additional things. But I think that's enough for now. That when we think about narrative, narrative is plot and story. Narrative, we can break it down into different ways. That we can break it down into core narrative events that we can call narrative kernels. And these are the things that are absolutely essential to the narrative functioning. And we also have within it narrative satellites, things that are not absolutely essential for the narrative to function, but may be essential to the narrative being enjoyable. I hope that's been of interest. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.